I'm Tiffany Tigas. I'm an administrator at the University Writing Center. Our topic for today's presentation is writing clearly and concisely. So the main goal, the central goal of any piece of writing is, of course, clear and effective communication. So you can be writing to persuade, you can be writing to inform, anything that you're writing about. Your purpose is to get that idea from your brain to that piece of paper so someone else can then read and understand what the point is that you're making. This goal requires, of course, that we revise, because often we'll be writing right before we submit something and we'll just be trying to fill that word count and putting a lot of fluff into our work. Or we'll be trying to sound smart or put information in there. We might not know exactly what we're saying at first, and we'll need to revise so we can get to that point. And if it's written clearly and persuasively, it'll be more interesting to read and get your point across more quickly. So take a look at this sentence. This is an example sentence. So in order to be able to analyze and investigate our data, we utilized various statistical software packages with different characteristics that are available in the digital medium. So this is one of my favorite example sentences for examples for making things more clear and concise, because there's nothing wrong with this sentence grammatically. It's fine. It is in the first person. We have the we there, and we'll talk later about how that might not be preferable for every discipline. But there's nothing grammatically incorrect about this sentence from a grammatical perspective. But if you think about what's being said here and what the author is trying to say, it's not super clear right away. And if you think about why someone might be encouraged to write this way, it's usually because, once again, they're trying to fill up the word count. I mean, this sentence has almost 30 words in it. That's moving your way towards reaching a word count in one single sentence. They might also not know exactly what they're saying, so they're saying a lot until they get to that main point. Or they might be trying to make themselves sound more intelligent. Maybe they had a point they wanted to get across, but they thought it didn't quite sound super academic. So they threw a bunch of different words in there to make it sound more convoluted and more complex. But we'll return to this sentence at the end of the presentation and see what we can do about it after looking at some strategies for addressing writing that's not clear and concise. But notice that these impressions that I discussed, none of them are really good to leave on a reader. So instead, you're not making yourself sound smart, you're not getting your point across quickly, you're instead ending up with something convoluted like this. And if you look at this quote from Oppenheimer, the pundits are likely right, write clearly and simply if you can, and you'll be more likely to be thought of as intelligent. So conversely with what's typically assumed, that the more words and the more jargon and the more expressions and the more complex of sentences you write, the more intelligent you'll sound, it's often the other way around. Instead, if you can get your point across clearly, that means you really do understand the content that you're writing about and that you can explain it to any sort of audience. So let's start with writing clearly. So we have the great enemy of clear language is insincerity by George Orwell. This really does get this point across, is that the best way to be clear, the best way to make sure that you are writing clearly and understandably, is to really know what you're writing about. So before you start writing, really think about what are you trying to say, what is your point, and that can help you really get to that point a lot faster instead of spending a lot of time kind of dancing around your main topic or your main point. So we'll start with some suggestions and some strategies for writing more clearly. The first is to delete or revise ambiguous words, especially those too informal for the situation. So you don't want to be using words that are super ambiguous and that end up not having much meaning because they're so ambiguous and imprecise. So words like really or so or basically or essentially, those end up not really having any meaning because they're used so often and they're not as precise as other words might be. You also want to avoid more informal words that you might use more often in conversation or talking to your friends, but they might not be as appropriate for a more formal setting. To decide if these words are too informal or for your writing, just think about what sort of audience you're writing for. Really consider who you're writing to and what you're trying to convey and what sort of authority you're trying to convey through your writing. And also the word vary too. I see this a lot in writing and it just doesn't mean anything at this point. It's often to emphasize or stress something, but you're not saying by how much or to what degree. So often if you can just look at your writing and remove the word vary, you'll end up with a lower word count and also getting more straight to your point. Or if you can find a word that is more specific than vary, it ends up being more clear and you can get straight to the point that you intend to convey. This, that, these, and those. Often these can be confusing, especially if you have a this right after a sentence with a lot of information in it. So what I often see is saying something like this student or that chair. Having that noun after the demonstrative pronoun can help really clarify what you're talking about. Clarity and complexity, though, it's kind of something difficult to balance because you definitely don't want to, be too simple with your speech. You might have still some complex ideas to get across. So this is a good strategy for where to put complex phrases in your sentences. The most important information, the new information, is easier to process if it goes at the end of the sentence. So here you have a more complex sentence. Lincoln's claim that the Civil War was God's punishment of both North and South for slavery appears in the last part of the speech. It's kind of hard to process because you're kind of waiting for the main point, and the end of the sentence isn't really the main point of the sentence at all. But then if you put that kind of contextual information at the beginning, in the last part of his speech, Lincoln claims that God gave the Civil War to both North and South as a punishment for slavery. So there you have the important information at the end and the contextualizing information at the beginning. It ends up being a lot easier for someone to process that than if it comes at the beginning. And here's another example of that too. So once again, the more complex phrase is easier for the reader to process when it comes at the end of the sentence than at the beginning. This is just a general thing to keep in mind, especially when you're working with complex information and reintroducing this throughout the paper, is to put that information at the end if it's new. And that's when someone's really ready to receive that new information as a reader, is when it's at the end of the sentence. So you also want to check for repeated words. And this is, of course, you want to be considering, am I using this word too much and is it becoming redundant, or is it actually useful as repetition and creating unity throughout my writing? So if it is an issue of redundancy and, oh, I use this word way too much, I need to find something else, then definitely use both a thesaurus and a dictionary so you make sure that you know why the definition for the word that you're using and why you're using it, so that you can make sure to be using the most accurate word and not something that doesn't mean what you intend to mean. But otherwise, you may be using the same word over and over because that's your topic and that's creating unity throughout your piece of writing. And that's okay, and you really have to consider, is this creating unity or is this creating redundancy? So here's an example. I'm just going to read these two sentences. So in the first example, this is using similar words throughout. You can see the highlighted words. With the most difficult questions are about the ethics of withdrawing intravenous feeding. Intravenous feeding can prolong life to an indefinite extent, but it cannot always preserve its quality. Without quality, many would argue life is worthless. And you can see too, I think this also really illustrates that other point I was making about introducing new information at the end of your sentences, because there you have intravenous feeding comes at the end of the first sentence, the beginning of the next introduces the new information about quality at the end of the next sentence, begins the next sentence with quality, introduces the new information at the end. So it kind of like has that chain, that connection between this whole paragraph, moving from old information to new, old to new, and using those words to kind of connect throughout the paragraph. Well, here, this writer wanted to maybe change up their word choice a bit and ends up going with, the most difficult questions are about the ethics of withdrawing intravenous feeding. Tube sustenance can prolong existence to an indefinite extent, but it cannot always preserve its quality. Without that, many would argue living is worthless. So you can see these are all different words. Maybe they're a bit more colorful. You're using existence instead of life. You're using tube sustenance instead of intravenous feeding. But it ends up not having that same level of connection and not that same level of flow. And you can kind of tell that the writer's just trying to change up words instead of just using what's natural and creating that sense of unity. All right, so moving on to modifiers. So of course, modifiers, it's in the name. We probably remember this from high school, in that the modifiers will modify another word in the sentence. It's there to make that point more clear and to tell us something about that other word. But there's two pitfalls that we can fall into with modifiers in general, and one is that they can end up being dangling modifiers, and the second is that they can end up being misplaced modifiers. So dangling modifiers are when the modifier is modifying something that's not in the sentence. So here we have plump and juicy, Aunt Gertrude won first prize at the fair. I'm guessing the writer didn't mean to call their aunt plump and juicy, but the word that plump and juicy is modifying is missing here. So if we look at a revision, we have plump and juicy, Aunt Gertrude's roasted pig won first place at the fair. Now we have the pig here, which is what plump and juicy is modifying. And here's another sentence. As a teacher, it is important to stay patient. Who's the teacher in this sentence? The teacher's missing here. So a revision would have, as a teacher, I need to stay patient. So there you have the teacher, as a teacher, modifying I. And you can really watch for these, especially with modifying phrases that begin with ing words. So for example, if you have like singing and dancing, what's that modifying? And then you don't have what's modifying later. You would want what comes after the comma to be singing and dancing, I walk down the street, so it's modifying I, and make sure that that is modifying what comes after that comma. Another thing to watch for is phrases that begin with as. So like, as a student, you want I to come after the comma. Instead of just, as a student, something follows that, because that's missing that the word that the modifier is modifying. So here's the other pitfall, is misplaced modifiers. So in this case, the thing that the modifying phrase is modifying is in the sentence, but it's too far away from the modifier to make sense. So here we have plump and juicy Aunt Gertrude makes the best roasted pig in South Texas. So roasted pig is here, but it's just way too late in the sentence, way too far away from the modifier to really make much sense. So here is a revision of this. So plump and juicy Aunt Gertrude's roasted pig is the best in South Texas. So you have it right next to what it's modifying. Same thing with rotting in the cellar. My brother found the 5-year-old potatoes. It seems like the brother's rotting in the cellar, which I hope isn't the intention of this sentence. But if you revise it, you can move the potatoes closer and say, my brother found the 5-year-old potatoes rotting in the cellar. So here you have 5-year-old potatoes and rotting right next to each other, so you can tell what that modifying phrase is modifying. So that's, I feel like that's a pretty simple and straightforward way to make sure that it's clear what you're modifying, is to just move those words closer together, move the word that is being modified closer to its modifier. Moving on to active and passive voice. So a lot of us have been told to avoid passive voice like the plague, and that active voice is always, always, always preferable, but that's not the case. You really need to consider what you're why you're writing what you're writing, and what discipline you're writing in. And the reason is that active voice puts emphasis on the actor, on the person doing the action in the sentence, while passive voice puts emphasis on what's being done. So you can see then why with humanities, when you might be looking at a particular author or a particular character, for example with literary analysis, you'll want to have that actor to being really present, because the focus is on that actor in the sentence. Well, if you're looking at a more science-based field and you're talking about a study you did, maybe you poured a certain amount of fluid into different beakers, it's not important that you poured the fluid, it's important that the fluid was poured. So that might not be as important to emphasize who did it as opposed to what was done. So here we have determined the target market as adults between the ages of 30 and 45. That emphasis is placed on the we, which may not be as important as just saying the target market was determined to be adults between the ages of 30 and 45, which I think the second would probably be more preferable for a STEM-based field. And if you're thinking about it too, if someone's reading this paper that you've written or the study that you've written, they know that the author is usually the one to have performed the research anyways. So it's not really necessary to say we all throughout the paper again and again and again. That's already understood. So just really think about which you're trying to place emphasis on, and it also is important and helpful to talk to your professor and see what's expected for your field before you choose one or the other. But once again, because you can see how the different emphasis changes the kind of meaning and point of the sentence, it can vary even within fields whether you use passive or active voice. One point though that I want to make here is that passive voice does require more words. You can see that the sentence with passive voice ends up being a bit clunkier. So if you can go with active, you can usually be more concise because you don't really need all those verbs to describe what's going on in the sentence. So here's a comment about to be verbs. This is another kind of concept that we tend to pick up from learning in high school, is that to avoid to be verbs, once again, avoid them like the plague. But that may not always be the case, but it can really help you put more information into your sentences instead of just having those to be verbs, which end up being kind of weak and not as informative as stronger verbs. So here we have John is. And what is this telling us about John? It's basically just telling us that he exists. That's great. I mean, just by seeing the word John, we know that John exists. So this doesn't really tell us anything at all. If you wanted to get to the point of this sentence, you would have to add a lot more to this sentence than is already present. So you have to say like John is swimming or John is a student to really get that point across, when you can maybe get it across much faster by just saying something like John swims or John waltzes. So there you have stronger verbs than just those to be verbs. And this is obviously not preferable for an entire piece of writing. It's really impossible to go through and remove every single to be verb and make everything more a stronger verb. That just doesn't really make sense all the time. But if you are ending up with more convoluted sentences and sentences that aren't really getting to the point, a good strategy is to take a look at those to be verbs, see where those are, and see if you can make them stronger, which often gives you the chance to get a lot more across in those stronger verbs than in the weaker to be verbs. So here's another example of that is with nominalization. So nominalization is when a verb is turned into a noun and used as a noun form. So you have the verbs in green and the nouns in blue, the nominalized nouns in blue. So we have, it is my belief that there should be consultation by the administrators with the student body before changes in the rules are made. In this case, the nominalization requires the use of to be verbs, which end up being not as strong as if you then take those nominalized nouns and turn them back into verbs, making it much more active and getting the point across a lot faster. So we have, I believe administrators should consult with the student body before changing the rules. All right, so that's writing clearly, basically. So now we're moving on to writing concisely. So once again, these do go hand in hand, and you can see how a lot of the suggestions I was giving you for writing clearly, they do make the writing more concise as well. But now we'll be looking at specific ways to make things more specifically concise. So I love this quote. This report, by its very length, defends itself against the risk of being read. Once again, if you have something that's really long and convoluted and just going on and on, it's less likely that someone is A, going to read the entire thing, and B, going to really understand what your point is, because you're spending so much time talking about things that could probably be cut or made more streamlined. We'll start with, these are kind of easy ways to look through your writing, and I'm really guilty of those double words, because I often feel like if I put two words together, it'll make my point even stronger than it initially was. But really, it's unnecessary, and it ends up kind of bogging down your writing, and that's not the point you're trying to get across anyways. So for example, like full and complete, you don't need both of those words, just choose one, they mean the same thing. Tried and true, you don't need both of those. Each and every, once again, mean the same thing. So don't have those doubles, even though they might feel like you're making a stronger point. It ends up just, you have more words there, and a single word can get it across in a stronger manner than just having those words doubled. And then redundancies too. If a fact is a fact, it's true by nature, so true facts doesn't make sense and isn't necessary. A gift is once again by nature free, so free gift isn't necessary, you can just say gift. Another way to address this is, for example, with in a wise manner, you might be able to turn that into an adverb and say like, the student chose her classes wisely instead of in a wise manner, which ends up being more wordy. So that's another way, is if you turn it into an adverb, a word that modifies a verb, you can often save yourself a bunch of words as well. So deleting those redundancies can often reduce your word count and get to your point, once again, a lot faster. And that's another, I feel like that's the main concept of writing concisely, is that often people feel like they have to say a lot to get to their point, but if you can take a bit more time and choose one word instead of 4 words, often that you can find a word that's a lot more specific and a lot more precise and a lot closer to your intended meaning, and you can get that point across a lot clearer by being more concise. So there's that kind of double, clearly and concisely work hand in hand in these cases. So here's more revision of wordy phrases. These phrases I see a lot, especially in academic writing. It's kind of like academic ease almost. These appear all the time, and I think students end up thinking that these words make them sound more academic if they use them in their writing. But really, once again, not necessary. And sometimes you can even find verbs embedded in those phrases that you can then use to get make your sentences more active. So arrived at the decision, decided, is able to, can, a majority of, most. So just use these one words instead of these phrases to get to your point faster, because these phrases don't end up really meaning anything. You read them and they don't really get to the point, and you spend time kind of bogged down in are of the same opinion instead of just agree, which is the main point here anyways. So finding these alternatives to these often used phrases in academia can really get to your main point and end up making your words more concise. Another is to change negatives to affirmatives. I find this an incredibly useful tip because often I'll say things like not allow or not often because that's kind of what we do in speech. But if you can find, once again, that positive word instead, so prevent or rarely instead of not allow or not often, notice how much stronger those words are using that positive instead of using the negative. And making it negative kind of requires you to do mathematics in your brain, which for me, I know I don't want to be doing that when I'm reading. And you kind of have to do a bit of algebraic factoring and saying like you have, okay, but you have we got a double negative, so that means a positive, or you have that like, that negative that comes before a positive, so you have a negative. It's too complicated. And those words that are affirmatives end up being a lot stronger and a lot more specific than using a negative with another positive word. So back to the sentence that we started out with. So let's take a look at some of these phrases and see if we can identify some of the things that we talked about. So we begin with, in order to be able to, which is one of those kind of buzzwords with academic words, academic writing. What might be a revision for that? What could we use instead of in order to be able to? Just to? Yeah, exactly. I would definitely use just to here because that's a bunch of words and really all that needs to be said is just to. And then we have doubled words in here too. We have analyze and investigate. We have various and different, which really don't need to be used. And we really could just use one of them or the other one, or maybe they don't need to be present at all. And then think about what's actually being said here. So what do they mean by various statistical software packages with different characteristics that are available in the digital medium? Where is software available other than in the digital medium? And often, if you're using various packages, why would you need to say that they have different characteristics? Would you be using various packages with the same characteristics? That's not really necessary to say that either. So my revision for this would be, we use statistical software to analyze our data. Really short, really concise, all those 4 lines condensed into one instead, gets the point across a lot faster. Another revision might be we analyzed our data using statistical software, because that way you're putting the statistical software at the end of the sentence if that is the new information. But the point is that you're getting to that point a lot faster than the longer convoluted sentence that we had before. We also have it more active with we used. Yes, and one other point that some students make is that maybe we should still include the word various here if that's important, or different statistical software if that's the important part of the sentence. But once again, it does depend on your meaning. It depends on what you're emphasizing.